And
Welcome back to Psychotherapy Networker.
my pleasure. Always a
I,
pleasure.
we're glad to have you back. Everyone out there who's watching from Psychotherapy Networker or the Norton Publishing Channel, welcome. We're here with Dr. Ken Hardy, who's the author of a phenomenal new book, and I have never said this before.
Hmm.
I've said this once. This book should be on every psychotherapist's shelf.
Hmm.
I said it about Carl Rogers on Becoming a Person before. So that was the other one.
Wow.
I have never read a book that was so helpful to me personally. And I read it this entire weekend
Hmm.
as a therapist. You start the book by saying this is probably the most important book you've ever written. And I want to know what made you say that. But for everybody watching, wondering, well, what is this book? Ken just released his brand new book from Norton called Racial Trauma, Healing the Invisible Wounds. And if you just go on Amazon and search Ken Hardy or Racial Trauma, you'll find the book, or on Norton's website. Just came out about 2 weeks ago. Ken, what made you say this was the most important book you've ever written?
I appreciate the question. I think for a variety of reasons. I think one is I mention somewhere in the preface or somewhere that in one sense, I felt like I've been writing this book my entire life. And so what the book afforded was an opportunity for me to tell pieces and fragments of my own story, my family story, my ancestors' story, the untold story of many clients that I've worked with over the years. And so I felt both the weightiness of that, but also the significance, because I just thought that as people of color, that, and I certainly include myself as a person of color, my identity as a therapist doesn't negate those experiences. That we walk through the world, I believe, suffering from a set of circumstances and wounds of trauma that, for the most part, have remained relatively unnamed. And because they've been unnamed, they've been unacknowledged. And because they've been unacknowledged, they're essentially in the offices of many therapists untreated. And so I thought that the book was permission giving, in a sense, for us, giving all of us as practitioners permission to name racial trauma, to retrain our eyes to look for it. And because we're able to look for it, we're much better able to see it. And because we see it, I hope that means that we're much more diligent and effective in treating it.
By the way, everyone listening, if you're watching live and you'd like to ask Ken a question, he's a hard man to find. He's very busy, so this is a great time to ask him a question. Also, if you'd like to see Ken live, either in person or online, he's giving the Sunday keynote address at the Psychotherapy Networker Symposium. This is one of the largest, most celebrated psychotherapy conferences on the planet. It's in Washington, D.C.
Absolutely.
next week. Oh, Cole, thank you for the banner. Ken will be with us. He's been there many times before. He's keynoted before, and we thought this was the year to bring him back. You talk about some myths around racial trauma or the discussion of race in therapy that I think a lot of therapists hold.
Mm-hmm.
But one of the keys that you said that I want to start with is that a critical first step is in this re-envisioning of therapy around this concept of racial stress and trauma is that racial stress and trauma exists as a daily reality for people of color, that we
Yes.
have to acknowledge that, number one. Number two, and this was the surprising one to me as a pretty obviously white person,
Mm-hmm.
And that is to say that racial stress and trauma is not only often invisible to non-people of color, white people, but that it's actually also often invisible to people of color too.
Absolutely.
And that if you as a therapist don't know this, you don't know how to talk about it, this actually may be affecting your clients, but it may never come up.
Right. Right.
Talk a little more about how racial stress and trauma is invisible even to people experiencing it.
Yeah. Yeah. See, I think that we live in a context of uh, racial oppression, and that racial oppression is almost like a kind of noxious gas that we can't see, and that it infiltrates us, and it's compounded by the fact that then we, in our society, I believe, we deny the significance of race, and so that's a lethal combination to have people of color subjected to conditions that are oppressive, to then have the broader sociocultural context we're in deny it. And so much of the life experiences of people of color that starts very early in life. I mean, it starts in the womb, that we are finding ways to adjust to living life under oppressive conditions. And we are so good at it as people of color, that our survival has been predicated on it. That's the side that's helpful. On the other end of that spectrum, we've gotten so good at it that it's all we know. And so there's a way in which we can easily walk around with metaphorical cuts that we're bleeding profusely and not see it, because so much of it feels normal in the sense that it's all we've ever known. And so it plays out in so many different ways. It plays out in ways where we have these tropes in our society about the dangerous black man and how dangerous people like myself are. But there's no corresponding trope for the dangerous white man who clearly has created havoc on the lives of people of color. And I don't just mean black people, I'm talking about indigenous people, Asian, black people, Latinx. And there's no characterization in our society for the dangerous white man or dangerous white people. And so there's something that seemingly benign as to know that you're perceived as dangerous shapes how you walk through the world. I was just visiting, doing some work at Columbia University a few weeks ago. A black male tenured professor says to me that I never meet with white students with my door closed. I leave my door open because I know if anything ever, he says, goes down and there's a dispute between my word and theirs, I don't have trust that my word uh, will withstand the scrutiny. That's an invisible wound
Mm-hmm.
that you have to show up at work with this consciousness about not just about how you're perceived, but then it becomes your job, your burden to make the necessary accommodations so that you can assuage those around you who might otherwise think of you as dangerous without any data to support that.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's why these wounds are actually invisible to people of color. I train therapists for a living. And before I can ever teach a student of color the difference between a coalition uh, and any other concepts, I first have to engage them in a process that helps them unpack all the internalized messages, racially based messages that they have before they can ever practice as a therapist. Because it is not uncommon for people of color, no matter how credentialed, no matter how much stellar they are, no matter how much they've contributed to the literature,
Hmm.
we all have these moments in our private moments where we're fighting off unwanted, intrusive thoughts about the possibility of am I an imposter?
Hmm. Hmm.
That's a wound of racial trauma.
I'm going to share personally, just for a moment. I'd love to hear your comments. The first time I realize I sound incredibly ignorant here, but just showing my cards. The first time this really hit me, I was having a conversation with Kent Butler. He's the former president of the American Counseling Association, and a Black man. He said to me, Zach, when was the last time you walked out your door and realized you were a white man?
Mm-hmm.
He said, every morning I walk out my door, every morning, very well-respected college professor.
Mm-hmm.
Every morning I walk out my door and I know I'm walking out my door as a Black man.
Mm-hmm.
And to this day, I think about that nearly every day. It's so, just that comment radically shifted all the stories I had in my head. And I had a lot as a therapist, Ken.
Mm-hmm.
I remember I was working in Southwest rural Virginia, if you can just picture that, and had a Black woman come into my practice, highly anxious, and talking about one of the sources of her anxiety not being able to find a job. She was in the financial industry, worked at banks. She would get interviews at banks, but then as soon as she'd show up for the interview, she wouldn't get the jobs. And she'd interviewed at something like a dozen banks,
Mm-hmm.
believing that because she had a white sounding name, she got the interview. And when she showed up for the interview and they saw she was Black, she wasn't getting called back.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember very clearly as a therapist, I completely overlooked that aspect.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I thought, well, let's focus on her anxiety. Maybe, or maybe that's not true. I mean, I was thinking all kinds of things that were not conscious, but I
Right.
was overlooking
Right.
that incredibly important piece that I've come to learn from people like you.
Right. Yeah, and I think I appreciate you sharing both of those stories. And if I were to marry them, I would say that on the one hand, having the privilege to walk through the world every day of your life and not think about the fact that you're white or what the consequences and implications of that are on other people. When you sit as a therapist, and I don't mean you personally, but certainly would include you, as a white therapist, and not thinking consciously about your whiteness, then you're not thinking about yourself as a possible source of anxiety that the client of color sitting in front of you may actually be experiencing, because you represent so much more than just a therapist. That, and I think this is true for you, it's true for me, that being a therapist has profoundly changed my life in terms of how I see the world, in rather remarkable ways. And so when I think about the impact that being a therapist has had on my life, well, this is also true for both of us, that I've also been Black longer than I've been a therapist. And so if being a therapist has influenced my life, can you imagine how being Black has influenced my life? The same is true for the white therapist. The white therapist has been white longer than he, she, or they have been therapist. And to never think about that in the context of the work, to think I can just show up and be present and be helpful to clients of color without interrogating, critiquing my whiteness, not even thinking about it, I think borders on flirts with harm.
Yeah, I would agree with you. Kevin, Ken, you listed 7 invisible ways that racial stress and trauma impact the everyday life of people of color. So seven ways are listed in your book. And I'm actually going to read those 7. So if you got your pen and paper, write them down. I can't put them on the screen. You can go back and watch this, though, anytime you want. Then you shared 15 myths that I want to get to some of those as well. But I want to read the 7 invisible wounds that are from your book. If you want to read more about them, please pick up Racial Trauma, which is available on Amazon and Norton. Here they are: 7 invisible wounds that impact the everyday life of people of color. internalized devaluation. Internalized devaluation, an assaulted sense of self, the feeling of psychological homelessness, voicelessness, number 4, voicelessness, loss and collective grief, an orientation towards survival. I'm guessing a daily orientation towards survival. You already mentioned that a little bit. And the 7th being rage, which was an interesting one to me. So those are the 7 invisible ways racial stress and trauma impacts the everyday life of people of color. Could you just expand on one or two of those and give us some context for why you chose them?
Mm-hmm. Well, I chose them because I see them rather prominently in the lives of people of color, and I've had to deal with all 7 and myself, and live with parents who grew up in the South, who were victimized by the very same wounds. And so that you cannot be a people for whom society deems almost exclusively through negative characterizations and not internalize those negative characterizations. And if you are exposed to them long enough, you no longer need white people telling you you're less than. You start believing it. You start operating from that frame. And so the devaluation is huge. And when the whole Black Lives Matter movement wasn't was was given birth to counteract devaluation, to say, hey, wait a minute, we're human beings, we matter too. And it was interesting to me that the pushback there was, well, all lives matter. So, which only exacerbates the devaluation. I don't think you can be devalued and where your life is pushed to the margins of society and not have what is an appropriate emotional reaction to that, which is rage. I think I make this effort in a book to draw a distinction between anger and rage, because I know that anger has been weaponized and used against people of color. So you have people of color who are walking around with very legitimate feelings to a set of unusual and inhumane circumstances, but then have to deny that they have those feelings because white folks come along and say, why are you so angry? And so rage is a natural byproduct of living a life of degradation and marginalization. And so I don't think you can be a person of color and not have rage. You can be a person of color, have rage, and not know you have rage.
Hmm.
And so all the secondary consequences of rage, they get played out in things like alcoholism or high blood pressure. I mean, that a whole range and myriad of health disparities that people of color suffer from that are rooted in rage and racialized trauma.
Ken, let's talk about some of the myths. You list 15 myths about racial stress and trauma. And by the way, as I think it's Estrella said, how might your work apply to people who are not Black, but who have also experienced racial trauma? And I think very clear throughout the book, you're talking about not just Black people, but people,
Right.
people of all, people of color, people of all kinds of different backgrounds. Let's talk about some of
That's true. And if I could just add real quickly,
Yeah,
that is
please.
absolutely true. And it's always interesting to me that, like in this interview, I mean, I've used the term people of color rather extensively, but I do know some people of color hear people of color and think Black, and that warrants interrogation as well.
Yeah, right. Let's go into some of the myths. We're not going to get through all 15, but again, they are in the book. And but there were a couple that stuck out to me, and I'm sure a couple different ones would stick out to different people. But this was an interesting one. Myth number whatever, I don't know what number it is, but one myth: race is relevant in therapy only when people of color are involved. I'll read that again. This is a myth. Race is relevant in therapy only when people of color are involved. Say more.
Well, I just think that it's a byproduct of our society that when we think of race, we think of people of color. That we don't often include white people in our discussions about race. And you know that just before this racial trauma book, I had a book come out specifically on whiteness because I think whiteness needs to be reinserted into our discourses around race. And even when this issue is addressed in academic training programs, it's always about uh, how I can prepare you to work with a client of color. Well, my years as a supervisor, where I spent a considerable amount of time behind a one-way mirror, I have I have empirical data that suggests that race is not just a people of color issue because I've had the occasion to watch sessions where the therapist is white and the client is white, and that there's discussions that come up in that therapeutic conversation that would not likely come up if I were in the room. And so, for example, a white client who says, this is one I've written about. I'm frustrated today because I had to ride the damn bus, and you know who rides the bus. You know who rides the bus. And want to say I had to be on a bus with a bunch of N word use and an S word to refer to Latinx to his white therapist. That client would not have said that to me. Might have thought it, but wouldn't have said it.
Yeah.
And so there's a way in which that race affects us all, regardless of our hue. And I think as long as we operate from that myth, then we don't engage white clients in conversations about race because we think it's a people of color issue.
Yeah. Another myth you list in the book, this was an interesting one to me as well. Race isn't an issue in therapy unless the client indicates that it is. Now, this really goes to the heart of the book, I think, because you talk pretty adamantly, at least that was my takeaway, that we as therapists sometimes need to take the lead in bringing up race in therapy. So let's talk about this myth that race isn't an issue in therapy unless the client indicates that it is. Say more.
I was trained that way. I was trained, look, if you bring up race, that's your issue. And even if the client brings it up, if it's not germane to the presenting problem, then why are you having this conversation? And I don't think it's that the therapist should often. I think it is a therapist's responsibility to bring up conversations about race because we operate in a societal context where we operate under a kind of gag order around race, that we understand cross-racially that it's not cool to talk about race. So we don't bring it up. And therapy just becomes a microcosm of the broader society. And I just don't know, it's inconceivable to me that we could conduct this intimate practice we call therapy and have something as robust as race around us and never bring it up in the context of conversation, no matter who the client is.
I wish every therapist could hear that because I too was trained. You don't bring up race unless the client brings it up. Doesn't matter who's sitting in front of you or what their background might be. You're flipping it on its head. And if you really want to learn how to do that, that is in Ken's new book. It's called Racial Trauma, and it just came out. Ken, this has been you're getting a lot of love in the chat on all the different
That's great.
Channels. This is such an important topic. I know we say it's an important topic, but as therapists, we need to know what to do. And it's the number one question I get. What do I do other than just be understanding and sensitive? Let me tell you, having read Ken's book, and I'm not just gushing on him because he's here. I feel like I got a huge piece of the puzzle filled in for me from your book. So thank you on what to do. And so, as we wrap up here, let's just recognize that this is and incredibly important, divisive, emotionally charged, one of the most polarizing issues of our time. And we as therapists can be part of the solution here and not be passive.
Mhm.
And let's just be really honest of what's going on when we often have these conversations.
Mhm.
Many white people are convinced, and you say this in your book, so I'm not taking credit for this one. This was really near the beginning. Many white people are convinced people of color overemphasize the significance of race.
Mhm.
People like me.
Mhm.
And then many people of color are convinced white people underemphasize the significance of race.
Right.
And then each accuses the other of weaponizing race.
Right.
And if we're going to start having these conversations, that's one of the first barriers that we need to begin to overcome. I'll leave you with the last word here.
I think that's a profound last word to leave with, because I think if we ever going to build a bridge over that divide, that it really requires us to be able to hear and dignify each other, and to create space for that. I did want to say, Jack, that to take a moment to thank you for doing this. I really appreciate you doing it, because I know that you don't have to, and I know the issue of race is always so potentially polarizing and volatile that we shy away from it. So I appreciate you and your commitment with the networker to create a platform for this conversation to take place.
Yeah. Thanks for taking time out of your day to do this. I know you also have choices where you spend your time. Thanks for being such a longtime friend of Psychotherapy Networker and the late Rich Simon, who I believe that was such a beautiful friendship and a beautiful partnership. And I'm so glad we're continuing it.
Absolutely. Same here.
Everyone, you can go back and rewatch this on any social channel that you did watch this. You can pick up Ken's book on racial trauma. It's widely available. Just look up Ken Hardy. You'll see it. Also a reminder, Ken is keynoting our final keynote on Sunday, March 19th at the Psychotherapy Network Symposium. That is live in Washington, D.C. if you want to meet Ken, or you can watch from anywhere in the world live online as a virtual attendee. We're really proud to be able to offer Psychotherapy Networker to anyone. If you can't travel, the best conference in the world for therapists at a really low price. Oh, we got a confirmation from Ken. Really fun time, and we do hope to see you and see you all learning from Ken in the future. Thank you so much, everyone. Thanks for being here. Thank you, Ken. We'll talk soon.
See you soon. All right,
Bye-bye.
take care.